Welcome to this week's Sort of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to cover three topics. The first one is going to be the ongoing anti-government demonstrations in Georgia. Then we're going to follow up by focusing on some interesting developments on the ICC front. And then we're going to end it with the big issue, one of the big issues of this week, which was Hungary blocking EU military aid to Armenia. And for those of you who want to see an update on the march from Tavush, we're actually going to have a very special interview about that on Friday morning, which we will post right after the big rally is done in Yerevan on May 9th. Over the past 10 days, there have been massive demonstrations in Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, against a bill in which the government calls the foreign agent law and the opposition calls the Russian law. This has essentially been about funding formulas for political organizations, for media organizations. The bill is almost certainly to get final passage over a couple of days from now, over the next week. And what this bill does and why it's important, why this fight is so important and so heated, is because most of civil society in Georgia is actually funded by foreign monies, whether it's EU or the US. This is likely an attempt by the dominant party, the Georgia Dream Party, to be able to stifle and disable the opposition. The government's case is that foreign sources of funding need to be noted and the details about them need to come out. However, in reality, this is a much bigger fight than something that almost seems parochial if you're not from there. This is actually a continuation of the big war between East and West in many ways, between an opposition that is very much pro-Western, pro-EU, and a government that is very much pro-Russian. The political crisis in Georgia is caused by the contradiction of the fact that because of divisions within the opposition and the disorganization of the opposition, a party that actually has a minority view supported by a minority of people actually becomes the dominant party, while the people who in their 80th percentile are very much Western oriented and support joining the EU are not in power. This is essentially becoming the sort of the third front in the Ukraine war, whether it was Ukraine, whether it's Armenia, and now we're on to Georgia. Now, why is this important to us? For our purposes, a pro-Western Georgia, the state and the government on an EU track is the best outcome for us. A Georgian state that is looking to please the EU and the United States is a state that is spending less time trying to appease the axis of evil in our region, which is Moscow, Baku, and Ankara. And in conclusion, petty differences aside, a Georgia-Armenia combination heading in a Western direction is a political winner because each of these countries are greater as part of the whole than they are individually. Let's move on to our second topic, which is Bibi Netanyahu and the ICC. It was reported this week that the ICC prosecutor is actually considering charging the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and some of his colleagues for genocide or war crimes during the invasion of Gaza. In reality, this is not likely to happen because of intense Western or US pressure on them not to do so. But even so, this has already put the fear of God into Netanyahu and his government, not because they fear being dragged into a tribunal in The Hague as some African dictator, but they properly and correctly see this as a first step in the delegitimization of the Israeli state. Now, why is this important to us? It's important to us because we obviously have cases that we could file against the regime in Baku and the gangster who committed the war crimes and the genocide last year. And if something of this nature from the ICC can actually scare the Israeli state or concern them at a time when they're doing everything that they're doing, in essence, with the full backing of the West, this would be a kiss of death for some second-rate criminals in Baku. What this means for us is that we need to speed up and double down in our ICC filings and the criminalization of the regime. In fact, this is a national security issue, putting the regime under the gun, having this indictment, possible indictments hanging over their heads, is a security measure for the many years to come. Moving on to our third and final topic of the week, which is the news that the country of Hungary is actually blocking EU military aid to Armenia. This is in regards to a 10 million euro aid package that the EU has approved for Armenia. This is, again, it's a very small amount actually, but we all know that this is expected to grow over the many years. The specifics of this money, this was actually going to go to pay for a field hospital and auxiliary facilities for an battalion-sized army unit. The way the EU works is any funding like this, you need to have unanimous support, which means every country in the EU needs to support it. And in this case, every country does, except for the country of Hungary. It is said that for 2 weeks, the Hungarian state has actually been blocking this, and there's all kinds of activities from the Armenian foreign minister going to Budapest and pressure from other Europeans behind the scenes to actually for them to lift this. Now you might ask, why does the Hungarian regime do this? First and foremost, the president of Hungary, Viktor Orban, actually has a very special relationship with the regime in Baku. His government was likely bribed in 2012 to extradite the Azeri war criminal, Ramil Safarov, who hacked to death with an axe an Armenian officer during a NATO training session in 2004. It is also well known that the Orban government actually has the most positive relations with the Russian state within the EU, and they're always trying to block anything that has to do with helping Ukraine and anything that hurts Russia. Now, why is this important for us? First and foremost, these EU funds, as I said earlier, are likely to grow over the many years, and this military aid and relationship is likely to grow over the many years, and you don't want to set any kind of an example in which a country like this can cause problems for us receiving that military aid. The other important factor, which I think is actually the more important one, Viktor Orban over the past few years has actually become the darling of the American conservative movement, is actually a very close relationship with Donald Trump, who has a reasonable chance of being elected this November. He's become this darling because of his supposed opposition to George Soros, who, by the way, actually paid for his education, his anti-immigrant policies, and his supposed defense of Christian rights, going as far as to have actually a division in their foreign ministry that deals with the rights of Christians abroad. Let's actually hear Mr. Orban in his own words on these topics.
We should unite our forces. Today's progressives try to separate Western civilization from its Christian roots once again. They are crossing a line that should never be crossed. If you separate Western civilization from its Judeo-Christian heritage, the worst things in history happen. Let's be honest. The most evil things in modern history were carried out by people who hated Christianity. Don't be afraid to call your enemies by their name. You can't play safe, but they will never show mercy.
Well, Mr. Orban is actually correct in one thing that he said. We should never be afraid to call our enemies by their name. Well, Mr. Orban, I will call you and your regime by your name. You and your regime are no more than modern-day Pharisees. In conclusion, I'd like to ask Mr. Orban exactly what part of Christian values are supporting the ethnic cleansing of more than 120,000 people, Christians in this case, off of their land that they've lived on for more than 2,000 years, which is the position of your government, or systematically destroying Christian heritage sites in Artsakh, or what part of Christianity is supporting the cowardly murder of civilians and the raping and beheading of POWs, and finally, personally in your case, in taking bribes to free axe murderers from their just punishment. Thank you for joining me this week's episode of Insight.
Good faith! You are like whited sepulchres, all clean and fair without, but within, full of dead men's bones and all corruption. You see these stones, do you not? I tell you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. Yours is a house of desolation, the home of the lizard and the spider. Serpents, brood of vipers, how can any of you escape damnation? You shall not see me here again. Not until you learn to cry.